Victoria and I have been taking the time and some of the resource of a group of you over the last couple of years because we think this History Festival is a thing worth doing. And we think this year's programme gives you a huge amount to chew on. Our opening contributors will set something of a framework for a weekend which will touch, as always, on a variety of themes. This is not a conference. This is not a summer school. This is a festival. You're here to have fun. You will have fun. But there are several intertwining themes that we will talk about. So a long view on the relationship between this island, the neighbouring island, and the continental landmass a little further east, off the coast of which we will be, regardless of the decisions politically we make, in perpetuity. So that, a long view of the Irish-British continental European relationship is one thing that will run as a strand through this weekend. Another, unsurprisingly, is a review of where Ireland and its neighbours were in 1919 as we enter this year, or proceed through this year of the decade of centenaries. And we'll talk both about some things that are very specific to the Irish context, and we will talk about some of the global dynamics that were in play then and that have shaped much of the world that we live in now, consciously or unconsciously. And I think our opening conversation will offer you some of that, but also touch on a whole host of other subjects that are both contemporary and in the past. And as we think about why we were doing it, I was reminded of a story that the late Mary Holland used to tell. And I'm hoping that over the course of the weekend somebody will confirm the truth or otherwise of this story. But she tells a story about a report written for James Craig at the establishment of the short-lived but very important Civic Guard of the new Irish Free State in 1922. And James Craig sent a representative down from the north to see what was going on. He was invited to observe how this new state was forming itself. And apparently this man attended the swearing in of the Civic Guard. And as he wrote to Craig, he said that it became apparent that they didn't know on what authority they were going to swear the oath. And so after some consultation, they decided to swear the oath on the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And as he wrote, I think, generously, it didn't appear to do them one bit of harm. And that willingness to consider a range of possibilities, that willingness to give others the benefit of the doubt, and indeed to enjoy the benefits of doubt, is, I suspect, one strand that we'll explore in different ways over the weekend. And somebody can no doubt tell me, A, whether that man ever existed, and B, whether it's true. Anyway, I don't think we should detain you any further because you have two very much better qualified and more interesting people to listen to. It would be invidious of me to do much in the way of an introduction of the former Taoiseach John Bruton. But as you can imagine, his qualifications to talk to you about some of the things that we've just touched on are hard to match, both from his time as Taoiseach, but of course after that his period as EU ambassador to the US, and his fascination with our place in a European political future, and indeed his understanding of our constitutional past, make him a really interesting person, we felt, to begin this year's festival. And we're enormously grateful to him for doing it. We're also hugely grateful to Carl Dinnen, who is one of ITV's political correspondents in Westminster. You can imagine, I think, without my going into a great deal of detail, the sorts of things that have been on his agenda over the last couple of years. And more immediately, he is an extremely devoted father to a young son. So we have him, we have a particular debt of gratitude for tearing himself away from Zidane for a day to come and kick this off. So I would like all of you, if you would, to welcome and to thank our two opening contributors.
Well, Simon didn't want to talk too much about your career, John Bruton, but I'm just going to say that you first entered the Dáil in 1922. You were Minister for Finance. Did I say 1922?
Yeah, yeah. I was 22.
It's
in
going well.
1969.
You were 22. You know all this stuff better than I do. You were Minister for Finance, Minister for Industry and Energy, Minister for Trade, Commerce and Tourism, and then Minister of Finance again before you became party leader. And of course, as Simon said, Taoiseach, and then the European Union's ambassador to the United States. Since then, in 2009, when you finished that job, you might have deserved a bit of a rest, but I don't imagine you've taken one. Tell us just briefly what drove you to have such a varied and high-achieving career from such a young age?
A combination of necessity and opportunity. Basically, if I hadn't gone forward for the Dáil, for the Fine Gael nomination in Meath in 1969 at the age of 21, when I got the nomination, I might never have got to the Dáil at all, because the way the constituencies were being redrawn, an opening occurred at that time, which might not have occurred at any time later. So there was a necessity as well as an opportunity there. In other parts of my career as well, I feel that I took whatever chances I was given. I didn't have any sort of master plan to be in any given position, but I sort of followed what interested me or what I felt was necessary, and that seemed serendipitously to coincide with needs that others saw, which they felt I could fill.
But what did you want to do? I mean, even 21 is a very young age to be standing for the Dáil. Was it social justice? Was it because you thought you could do something useful? Was it faith? What were the things that made you want to enter politics?
Well, I think probably I just wanted to be a politician because I thought it was an interesting career, and a career which had the sort of scope and variety and, I suppose, room for egotism and showing off that goes with that profession.
That's very honest of you.
I just liked shaking the tree, so to speak. I wouldn't, claim I had some great design for the reform of the social welfare or tax systems at the age of 21. I did from a very early age, I think, and this would go back to before I was elected to the Dáil, have very particular views on the conflict in Ireland and on the extent to which we on this side of the border tended to take just one side in the conflict in Northern Ireland and to give no hearing virtually to the other side. And even before I was elected, I think I would have been motivated by wanting to do something to redress the balance. And, in political life, I have tended a lot of times to take the view that's not the currently popular one, because I think you're more likely to perform a useful service by challenging received notions than by simply cheerleading around received notions.
So you get to the stage where you are the Taoiseach, you walk into the office, 15th of December 1994, and one of your first decisions is to change the decor. You wanted a new picture in there.
Yes, well, I had one of the first questions I put down in the Dáil, actually, in probably 1969 or 1970, was to ask the then Taoiseach Jack Lynch if he would bring out a stamp to commemorate John Dinnen, John Redmond and Joe Devlin. And he sort of made some friendly noises about this, but didn't commit himself to doing it. And I said, but Taoiseach, isn't it the case that they're the people who are pursuing the policy that you're now pursuing of peaceful means, and shouldn't we be commemorating them? And I could see a Fianna Fáil TD across the table, across the chamber, whom I knew well and liked, and I could see his false teeth falling down at the outrageous statement that his constituency colleague, actually, I was his constituency colleague, had made. But so I mean, this wasn't a new thing when I decided that I would put up the picture of John Redmond in the Taoiseach's office. I think John Redmond did more than most to bring about the possibility of Irish self-government. He devoted his life to it, his entire life, from a very early age. And he died at a very young age, for modern terms anyway, in the early 60s, having devoted his life to Irish self-government.
So what did he do? I mean, it's the men of 16 who are often celebrated, but what did John Redmond do? What did John Redmond do that led to
Well, he and
Irish
the Irish
independence?
Party brought about, well, first of all, they succeeded in getting land reform, to get the ownership of the land of Ireland transferred from landlords, some of whom were absentee, some of whom were not, to those who were actually working the land. And that was achieved by him and others in the period from 1880 up to, well, it finished in the mid-1920s, but right up to 1914, that had been done. So that created, if you like, a rural middle class, a property class that had a stake in the country, which I think was crucially important as an explanation as to why the Irish Free State remained democratic, when other states that were formed around the same time didn't, because in many of the other states, such as Poland, for example, the land question had not been settled. And the effort of settling the land question was so divisive that the countries couldn't sustain democracy in the same way as Ireland and Finland and I think Czechoslovakia did. So I think that's number one. That was laying a foundation. Secondly, I think they succeeded in being masterly parliamentary tacticians. When the Liberal Party found in the 1911 election that it didn't have a majority, and it needed the Irish Party if it was to introduce its radical tax reform policies, the Irish Party was quite firm and cold in saying to them, we will only support you if you not only promise to introduce Home Rule, but promise also to introduce a Parliament Act to remove the House of Lords veto so that that bill can be passed into law. And I think that was a pretty brave stand to take, because they knew that if the Liberals didn't do this, and if there was a general election, or if they looked for too much and forced the Liberals from office, and there was a general election, strong possibility would have been that the Conservative opposition would have become the government of the country and the cause of Home Rule would have been lost. So they needed nerves of steel in a way at that time, and they had them, and they succeeded, and Home Rule became law on the 18th of September 1914 on the basis that it was for the whole of Ireland, but that there was a temporary possibility of opt-out for certain counties in Ulster. But it was designed for the whole of Ireland. And that, I think, was a tremendous achievement, an achievement that had not been one of Parnell or of Daniel O'Connell or of Isaac Butt, but it was achieved by John Redmond and John Dinnen. And I feel that the Irish state, right through its history, has inadequately recognised the achievements of constitutional nationalism and over-glamorised and over-celebrated the activities of violent republicanism.
So what then happens, of course, is the First World War, 1916. We know all about that. And although the counterfactual is obviously a difficult thing in history, do you think that had the war not intervened and had things gone along the path Redmond was taking them, that Ireland would have achieved the same sort of full independence that it eventually did?
Maybe not the same independence, maybe not on the same timescale. But once Home Rule was on the statute book on the 18th of September 1914, it became rapidly very clear that there was no intention on the part of the Conservatives of repealing it. So that when they were not going to implement it yet because there was a war on, which in a way is not all that surprising. You don't want to be doing major constitutional innovations in the midst of a conflict of that scale. But it was clear that it was going to come in anyway, as it did, in fact, in the 1920 Act. That was, in a sense, Home Rule, but not for all of Ireland, but it was Home Rule. And indeed, in the manifesto of the Conservative Liberal coalition in the December 1918 election, that contained the statement, Home Rule is on the statute book. In other words, they were not going back on it, which is, a view that's not widely understood, I think, in this country. There was no going back on it. Now, I think it would have been much more limited in some respects than what was obtained after the expenditure of many lives and ultimately leading to a civil war in the War of Independence. It wouldn't have been the same in one or two respects, important respects. The Home Rule administration was not going to have its own army. It mightn't have needed it. Certainly the Free State did need an army when they took over, because they were being opposed by violent, irregular forces. So they did need an army. The other difference was that under Home Rule, because it was designed for the whole of Ireland, the Home Rule administration wasn't given power to introduce or abolish divorce. And this was because, given that Home Rule was designed initially for the whole of Ireland, it was felt that the Unionist population in Northern Ireland would be dissuaded from coming in under Home Rule if they felt that they were going to have one denomination's view of marriage policy carried through by majority vote. So that was retained in Westminster. And another power that was retained, again for the same reason, to make the possibility of a united Ireland more achievable, was they were not given the power to impose tariffs on goods coming from other countries, from England or from other countries. And that was done because, in a way, the economic policy interests of industrial Northeast Ulster were ones that promoted manufacturing and wanted access for manufacturing goods. And the fear of unionists would have been that if you had an all-Ireland state, with agriculture being its predominant interest, that they would, be prepared, for example, to favour agriculture to the disadvantage of manufacturing industry. So in order to get over that power wasn't included. It's interesting in a way that one of the things that people fought for and got was the power to introduce border controls and tariffs.
Well, they didn't want to be stuck in a customs union.
That's sort of current again.
Yeah.
But from a different point of view, different people with a different perspective.
Instead, of course, as we said, we get 1916 and history took a different turn. Now, you've written in quite forthright terms about the way 1916 has been celebrated and venerated and taught in schools. I know it's a big subject, but what are your main points about the celebration of 1916?
One of the reasons I was very disappointed that the Irish state didn't have a big commemoration of the passage of Home Rule into law in September of 2014 was that it would have been a good context for then commemorating 1916, because you'd be saying, well, we are commemorating constitutional steps towards independence, and of course we've got to commemorate other steps that were taken that involved the loss of life, because they both contributed in some fashion to the greater degree of independence that we got. But in the absence of any real commemoration of Home Rule in 2014, I was worried about the commemoration of 1916 because, first of all, I think it was unwise to undertake a rebellion in an alliance with three countries that were at war with the UK. This was undertaken in alliance with Germany, explicitly acknowledged in the Constitution. That made it, of course, difficult for Irish representatives to get a hearing in Versailles, because the people who were looking to be represented in Versailles had allied themselves with Germany 3 years earlier in 1916. That was number one. Number two, I don't think it met the Christian criteria for a just war. Under the Christian criteria for a just war, among other things, to go to war must be a last resort. Well, given that Home Rule had been passed into law only 2 years previously, I think it wasn't a last resort. They could have given it a chance to see what would happen with Home Rule, and if it didn't happen, maybe then. And there were a number of other reasons. I also think that 1916 wasn't ought to be presented in a way as a civil war, because the first victims of it were Irish-born members of the Dublin Metropolitan Police, Irish-born members of the Royal Irish Constabulary, and I think more ought to have been made officially of that. Now, I know that others, some present here, Stephen Collins, I saw in the audience earlier, and others have done much to remember some of the victims of 1916 who were in the RIC and in the Dublin Metropolitan Police, and indeed, of course, far more Irish civilians who had nothing to do with either side were casualties. But of course, once you start a war, and we know who started this particular event, you have to accept responsibility in part for what happens, the foreseeable consequences of starting a war, which in part in this instance was the bombardment of Dublin.
So when you were in office, did you take part in commemorations outside the GPO at Easter? What approach did you take to that?
Well, I took part in Arbour Hill in the commemoration there each year of commemoration of those who died for Ireland. Now, of course, who died for Ireland? You could. Is that only those who died on one side, or does it include those who died on behalf of a different vision of Ireland? Is it their motive and their sincerity you're commemorating, or just the side they were on? And I think that's very often, quite understandably, left a little vague. Now, one of the things that I did do that I think was inclusive was that I had a major commemoration ceremony in Island Bridge, marking the 50th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, in which, of course, as we know, very large numbers of Irish people from this state, as well as, of course, Irish people from Northern Ireland, took part on the side of the Allies in what was a war to defend human rights, and it was a war that cost our next door neighbour Britain very dearly, and from which we all and the world benefited very greatly from their sacrifice and struggle. And that was commemorated, and I was very delighted to see that not only were there representatives of the Ulster Unionist Party came to Dublin for this, but representatives of Sinn Féin from Belfast were there as well, some of whom I think told me that some of their ancestors had actually served in the First World War in the British Army. So I think it was I think commemoration of those two wars has a tremendous possibility for bringing the two parts of Ireland closer together, because I think the differences that exist between Unionists and Nationalists in Ireland are a lot of them about identity and symbols and a sense of who you are. They're not principally about laws or what place you give to the Irish language or what economic policy you follow. They're more about a sense of being respected. And I think the commemorations that have taken place of the First World War are ones that can be shared by both communities on the island. And I think and indeed can be shared by our neighbours in the next door island, from whom unfortunately we're going to be somewhat alienated in the future.
We'll come on to that. But before that, I just want to talk about the commemorations that are approaching, particularly 1919. How do you think those should be approached, given that they will inevitably stir painful memories? Is the state in a place where it is commemorating these things in an inclusive manner, or do you see a risk there of tensions?
Well, I'm not the world's greatest expert on exactly what the state is doing in this respect. So, if I'm incorrect in anything I'm saying, check it with those who know war. But my understanding is that the state is going to have fairly limited numbers of commemorations. They're not going to commemorate every ambush. They're not going to commemorate every killing. they're going to have a commemoration of the sacrifice on both sides. And one of the things that I think is wonderful is that in Glasnevin Cemetery, they're going to have by name all the victims recorded. All of the RIC, the Dublin Metropolitan Police, and the volunteers, IRB, they're all going to be there because they were all human beings, all God's children, and they all died far too young because of the initiation of this armed struggle. And I think that's the best thing we can do. I mean, I don't think the state should, reverse itself and go saying, downgrading the sacrifice of those who fought in the War of Independence on the side of independence. That would not only be politically unwise, but I think it would be quite unfair. But what would be fair is to commemorate both sides. And I think, but people have to go out of their way to do that because, these people have descendants, and there are also the people who killed some of these people have descendants, and people know who killed who, and it is a very painful issue. So we have to deal with it fairly and dispassionately. It's an issue that hasn't been addressed maybe as fully as it could be, but I think good efforts are being made at the moment. And we see, I think, in Northern Ireland, in the issue about the legacy of the past and the fact that so few people have been prosecuted for some terrible crimes up there, we do see a need for that sort of process. And if we can find a way, a formula or an approach for dealing with this more distant past event here, it may be helpful at some stage in the future in how that issue could be approached in Northern Ireland and in respect of that armed struggle.
Interesting thought. During this time that we're talking about, often the history books focus on the warring parties in the War of Independence and then the Civil War. But what became of that strand that you were talking about earlier, that Redmondite constitutional nationalism, if I can call it that? Does that just disappear, or is it still there?
It didn't disappear. First of all, I think in the election what was it? 1922 election, I think it was. Yeah. One of the messages that came very clearly from that election was that the treaty should be supported. And that was not because Cumann Gael, the party of the treaty, had won an overwhelming majority. They'd only got 39% of the vote or something like that. Unfortunately, they haven't reached that only once since. We'll go into that. And it wasn't under my leadership that they got it either. But they got 39%, which wasn't a majority. But the majority was made up of, on the pro-treaty side, by a very strong showing by the Irish Labour Party, which accepted the treaty, and the Farmers' Party, ratepayers and other independents, many or most of whom came from the Old Irish Party. And they, then formed the National League, which could have changed the government in 1927, but didn't, because Captain Jinks was waylaid and didn't turn up to vote, and Cosgrave survived. And then when De Valera came in 1932, one of the things I found interesting to know, one of his achievements was to enact a new constitution, because the constitution of 1920, was it 1923 or 24, I'm not sure of the date, was considered by anti-treaty people to have been dictated by Britain in the treaty, and they didn't accept its legitimacy. And Mr. De Valera sought to try and establish a new basis for the legitimacy of the Irish Constitution. So his formula was that he would write a new constitution and it would be approved by the people, which it was in 1937. So a new basis for legitimacy, deriving from the Irish people and not from any external power, was put in place. And that, in a way, settled the treaty debate. But the interesting thing to note is that his principal legal advisor in drafting that was a man called Hearn, who had been called the boy speaker of the Irish Party. He was a great orator at the age of about 21 or whatever in 1918 and spoke up for Willie Redmond and helped Willie Redmond to win the seat in 1918 against the Sinn Féin tide. He was, out and out Irish Party against violence of any kind, joined the Free State Army as Judge Advocate General, but when De Valera came into power in 1932 or 33 or whenever he wanted to write a constitution, he heard about this very well-educated lawyer, Hearn, and he brought him in, and Hearn actually wrote a lot of the constitution that De Valera, under De Valera's direction and with De Valera's direct involvement, they used to have meetings in Hearn's house where Mrs. Hearn had to bring up tea for the president of the Executive Council, and they worked late into the night. But he was another person coming from that tradition, and of course James Dillon comes from that tradition, and I come from that tradition. I'm ashamed of saying that.
Through some of this period that we've talked about, the 1916, certainly the War of Independence, those who were fighting against British rule often looked to Europe for help. And I want to come on to that part of the sort of triangular relationship as will be talked about later in the festival. It strikes me that in some respects that it's a fact of geography that Ireland might always look over Britain's shoulder for help. And one wonders if that's what's happening today. Is there a difference between what happened then? Well, obviously, it's not violent now, but Ireland still seems to be looking to France and sometimes Germany to help balance out British power.
Well, I think that's only being done because of a situation that has been created over which we had no control. The decision to have a referendum on Brexit and to proceed with the most advanced possible form of Brexit on the strength of a very narrow majority in a referendum. That's something that it's a situation that Ireland was faced with, and the European Union, of which we're a member, was faced with. And the European Union has been, I think, more assiduous in trying to deal with the inherent contradiction that there is between Brexit and the Belfast Agreement. They are completely contradictory, and yet they're both signed up to by Britain. One in 1998, another through the referendum in 2016, and they completely contradict one another because Brexit is about taking back control, and you take back control typically at your border. So Brexit is inherently about creating new border controls. The Belfast Agreement, on the other hand, is all about converging between North and South in Ireland, between the two communities in Northern Ireland, and between East and West, between Ireland and Britain. And obviously the erection of barriers of any kind, either East, West or North, South, which flow directly from Brexit, created a situation where the Irish government and the European Union, in a way, you could say the European Union took the British commitment of 1998 to the Belfast Agreement and all that flowed from it more seriously than Britain itself did. Now, I take heart from the fact that Boris Johnson said in Belfast that he accepts both the spirit and the letter, these are his words, the spirit and the letter of the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement. Now, I wait to see how he's going to give effect to that in light of Brexit. We hear suggestions, for instance, that they could be having to consider, if there's a no-deal Brexit, the reintroduction of direct rule. Now that, I'm told, would be a straightforward contradiction of the Belfast Agreement, because it would be setting aside something on the basis of which we changed our constitution and the parties in Northern Ireland agreed to enter into consociational government or whatever, I don't know what it's called, that they have. And that would be being taken away by precipitously going forward towards a no-deal Brexit and rejecting the backstop. Now, the backstop is a very imperfect instrument. And you could criticise it in many ways. You could say, well, why should Northern Ireland have rules made for it that it's not directly involved in the making of? And there's no answer to that question, except that's the only way that the European Union could find to ensure that there wouldn't have to be borders in Ireland.
Well,
I would also make the point very strongly that for a British government to plead innocent and say, well, we're not going to introduce borders, it's all going to be done by the EU. Well, the EU rules in the customs code, which required the imposition of borders, were made with British involvement. Britain was part of the European Union making those rules, so they know exactly what we're obliged to do.
I can hear the people I would normally speak to in London saying, well, we would have kept the border open by negotiating the withdrawal and the future relationship at the same time, and then we would know where we were going to land by the time that the withdrawal agreement had been finalised.
Well, to do that, they would have had to abandon Mrs. May's red lines. And this is the reason for the backstop is to be found in the red lines set by Mrs. May in the October 2016 Conservative Party conference address, where she said, no customs union, no single market, and no jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Now, from those three no's sprung the inevitability of a border controlled in Ireland, of a hard border of some kind in Ireland. Because if you're not in the customs union, you cannot have your goods allowed into the European market customs free. If you're not in the single market, you cannot supply services into the European Union without having your rules similar to the rules applying in the European Union here in the South and in the rest. And if you don't accept some system of arbitration of what the meaning of rules are, like the European Court of Justice, then you are inevitably going towards borders. And the backstop was put forward as an alternative to that. Now, it's important to say the backstop was originally suggested by the European Union side just to apply to Northern Ireland. And it was at the request of a British government in which the Conservative Party voted confidence that the idea of extending the backstop to the rest of the UK was agreed by the European Union side. That was a British request. Now, for people to now say in Britain that, this is all a plot by the Europeans to force us to accept EU rules, it's not, because it was Britain that asked for the backstop to be extended to Britain as well as to Northern Ireland.
There are those who would argue in the Conservative Party that the way that they want to ensure there is no border in future is to have this full, comprehensive free trade agreement. From what you said a few moments ago about having to leave the single market and the customs union inevitably leading to a border, sounds like you don't think that even that agreement that they envisage would mean there was no border.
Well,
there will have to be one.
Of course. I mean, if Britain, if the free trade agreement is one that rules out similar being a customs union, if it rules out being in the single market, there will have to be obstacles to the provision of single market services from a non-EU country into the EU single market. There would have to be obstacles to that. Otherwise, the single market would cease to have any meaning. So that's inevitable. Now, I mean, if there was a possibility of devising some sort of free trade agreement or close association that would somehow or other manage to have Britain not in the customs union, not in the single market, not accepting any jurisdiction, but not having to have any border, I would have thought that in the last 3 years the British side would have produced a draft of this possible agreement, illustrating exactly what it might contain and how these various issues could become, a detailed prospectus of the sort of agreement they would like. Now, they're saying that, we weren't allowed to negotiate with Britain, with the EU about it. But surely they had their own ideas. I mean, they're the ones that initiated Brexit. One would expect that they had their own ideas of what the future relationship would be in detail. But they haven't produced any ideas beyond the sort of soundbite. We want a deep and comprehensive agreement, which is only a soundbite. But soundbites don't make policy.
Imperfect as the direction they're taking may be, and as imperfect as the backstop may be, they are presumably, in your mind, less bad than a no-deal, so-called no-deal Brexit, which is what we seem to be heading towards at the moment. I mean, the apparent refusal of the EU, as the British would have it, to negotiate even a time limit to the backstop.
Well, hold on a second.
Means that the British think that
the underlying
no deal is the way is going to have to be the way they go.
The underlying supposition in your question isn't correct, because the British Conservative Party have now elected a new Prime Minister who says that he will not enter into negotiations unless the EU agrees in advance to drop the backstop in its entirety. That's his position now. So there's no question
there
time limits or anything.
Well, there was a time when a time limit might have got it through Parliament, but I agree that time may well have passed.
I doubt that, because my experience of dealing with the UK on European Union matters is that they look for a concession and they say, this is vital, we get this concession. And I saw this directly in the Convention on the Future of Europe dealing with Justice and Home Affairs. They wanted this concession, and that's all we need. No sooner had that concession been made to them than they forgot about it. They never said a word about it afterwards. And then they came forward with other things that they wanted. And that's been the experience. It was also, the experience when David Cameron went to Brussels after to renegotiate the terms of British membership. Some concessions were made to him that should never have been made. For example, removing commitment to ever closer union and introducing a potential veto on legislation for national parliaments, which would completely paralyse the European Union. Those concessions were, however, made to him. They shouldn't have been, but they were. He then fought the referendum and never mentioned these concessions, or the concessions that were made to him in regard to social welfare rights for immigrants from EU countries, which were designed to meet the immigration problem. So the experience, I'm afraid, has been that concessions once received are pocketed and a new demand is made. So I think, the idea that Ireland could have resolved all this by offering them, a 10-year time limit or something like that. No sooner would that have been done than it would have been forgotten, and they'd be on to the fact that the withdrawal agreement is requiring them to maintain a level playing field in regard to competition policy, that Britain cannot become a social dumping arena right beside the European Union. They'd have been objecting to that, and eventually there'd be nothing left. And then they'd say, well, we're not sure we want to pay the whatever money they owe either.
Just sticking with Brexit just for a short time longer, do you think no-deal Brexit is the way that we're headed, or do you think Boris Johnson is bluffing?
I don't think he's bluffing. I mean, he's said so much now that it's very hard for him to, it would be very hard for him to go back. On the other hand, he's said things that contradict what he said previously. I mean, he is looking for the backstop to be removed, and yet he says, as I said, that he's committed to the letter and spirit of the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, these are all, phrases that trip easily from the tongue, but what content is there in them? That remains to be seen. Perhaps we'll see, sometime in late September. And
does that inevitably, if we do get this no-deal Brexit, does that inevitably lead to a harder border? I suppose it does. And does that then really increase the risk of violence?
Yes and yes.
Because the sorts of people who would be intent on violence, they already have plenty of targets there. If they blow up courthouses and railway lines and telephone boxes, I don't know, there are targets out there for them.
I think it's not to do with physical targets. It's more to do with the fact that people on this island and in Northern Ireland feel that in the Belfast Agreement, on the basis of which we changed our constitution, which is in an international treaty, a new dispensation was inaugurated in Ireland on the basis of which, no matter who was the sovereign in Northern Ireland, that Catholic or nationalists could feel as Irish as they wanted to be and still live comfortably in Northern Ireland, and Unionists could be as British as they wanted to be and still live comfortably in Northern Ireland, and that there was gradual convergence between the two parts of Ireland and between Ireland and Britain, equally important to stress. That is the sort of psychological setup that will be being smashed by a no-deal Brexit.
The troubles when they happened weren't just about the border, though, were they? I mean, they were about social circumstances and social injustices, many of which have been dealt with. So the same circumstances no longer pertain.
Most of the major grievances were dealt with quite early on, actually. What the struggle was about respect and identity. And I think the crucial issue is to find a way in which Unionists can feel that their British identity is fully recognised, and that Irish or nationalists can equally feel that their identity is fully recognised. Now, I don't think that the pressure, for example, at the moment about the Irish language from Sinn Féin is all about a lot of people wanting to speak Irish, or wanting street signs in Irish because they might lose their way because they don't understand the street signs in English. I don't think it's anything to do with that. It's about a sense of respect, that our tradition is being respected. Now, I would say that both sides are remiss in making an effort to try to understand the needs for respect of the other side. Both sides are remiss in failing to understand the vulnerability and the fearfulness of the other side. And that's been endemic in the way people have voted in Northern Ireland. I mean, the idea that you'd vote for a party that won't take their seats at a crucial moment because you feel that's the best way of expressing a strong sense of Irishness seems to me to have, inverted things a little bit. It's not the right order of priorities, I think. And similarly on the Unionist side, that people would vote for a party in order to increase the weight further on their end of the seesaw, so to speak, to counterweight on the other end. That sort of behaviour, which sees everything as a zero-sum game of, I'm getting the better of you or you're getting the better of me, it's utterly fruitless. And the whole idea of the Belfast Agreement was to get away from that. And I think it's unfortunate. I don't see how Boris Johnson can reconcile his acceptance of the letter and the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement with his insistence on a no-deal Brexit within a couple of months. There seems to be a fundamental contradiction there. And I think the backstop was nothing more than a rather difficultly drafted piece of legalese designed to create a bridge between two contradictory British positions. The British position in accepting the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 and the British position in opting for Brexit in 2016. These two positions are fundamentally unreconcilable. The backstop was an attempt to reconcile them because the British government of the day didn't come up with its own reconciliation. You can criticise the EU for what it has produced, but you can't criticise them very much because those who are doing the complaining haven't come up with an alternative.
How do you think all this has affected relations between Britain and Ireland at that governmental level, the level that you were operating at? What do you think it is like now compared to when you were dealing with, I think it was mostly John Major?
Well, I found my my relationship with John Major was very good, and his agreement of the Downing Street Declaration with Albert Reynolds, I think, was the foundation of the process. It was without that agreement, which was negotiated with everybody's involvement, and I give great credit to the John Major for involving the Unionists in that, as Albert Reynolds involved people on the nationalist side. That was the foundation, and I was working with John Major, building on that foundation. There was no difficulty. Except I knew at times the issue of decommissioning He was under pressure to get the weapons decommissioned straight away. I was under pressure not to insist on it now, but to get Sinn Féin into a talking mode. And eventually we came up with the idea of a twin-track approach, that we'd deal with decommissioning of weapons in one track and the political setup in another track, and that we would set up the negotiation to get around the issue of unelected people by having an election to a negotiating body. That was a good formula, and it was the formula upon which my successor, Bertie Ahern, was able to go forward with the Good Friday Agreement.
It was not.
There were no difficulties of the kind that I think are in prospect at the moment.
There were difficulties in the process, though, weren't there? In 1996, I distinctly remember February 1996 when the IRA bombed Canary Wharf. I was in a pub near work with many colleagues, and the news editor came in and started grabbing people from the bar and throwing them out, sending them back to work. Do you remember where you were when you heard about that bombing?
I do well remember when Inan Bashir and John Jeffries were murdered by the IRA, who had not too long previously been telling George Mitchell that they were completely committed to peace. I remember very well where I was. I was in an Academy of Art, or an art gallery in Ely Place, when I was told that this atrocity had been committed. It showed the deep insincerity of the Republican movement, because my understanding is that that bomb had been in planning for months previously, while all the talking was going on. Obviously, they must have felt that they weren't moving fast enough, or they perhaps hadn't, when the initial ceasefire had taken place in August 1994, that had been missold to the troops in the IRA, and that they were given to believe that it meant more than it said. And that was why, if you recall, Gerry Adams was always looking for clarification, which clarification, he meant that he wanted the meaning of what the word said to be changed, not clarified, I think. But that didn't happen, and this is what happened, as we know. But it has, in terms of Anglo-Irish relations, there is no real parallel to what we're facing now, because on that occasion the Irish and British governments were working hand in hand off the same page, with only slight differences of emphasis. And it's important to say that from the point of view of this state, we wanted the arms decommissioned too. We didn't want two armies in this state. We have one very good army in this state, and I think we should support that army. We don't want any second one.
There are those who argue that 1996 bombing was the point at which John Major dropped his demand for decommissioning before talks, and that there are those who claim that the British government was therefore bombed back to the negotiating table.
Well,
what do you think of those claims?
I don't want to, I'm not able to go into a sort of a detailed day-by-day sequence of all the things that happened, but I recall a discussion I had with John Major in Mallorca, where we discussed a way of breaking the logjam. And at that time, the Unionists had been calling for an election. And I had the idea that one of the things in a successful negotiation is to get your hay onto somebody else's cart. And that's the best way of getting your hay to the market. And if the Unionists were suggesting the cart of an election, why couldn't we put the hay of political talks onto their cart as a way of giving them some sense of ownership of the process? That's the bit I remember, because it was my own ideas, so to speak. I remember the discussion I had.
Did you tell John Major you wanted to put your hay on someone else's cart?
I'm not sure I used that. I'm not sure I used that analogy. I don't think I did, but I remember where it was. We were in a bus on Mallorca going to some meeting, but it may be, that the British adjusted their position. I mean, decommissioning wasn't an unreasonable request in and of itself, because what we were proposing to have was a political negotiation. And the idea that you'd have one party with guns and 3 other parties with no guns negotiating, and the party with the guns retaining the option of taking up the gun again, it created an asymmetrical negotiating position. And if you read Seamus Mallon's book, you'll see that he took the view that the British were too soft in insisting on decommissioning, because he believed that this was not a symmetrical negotiation. And Seamus Mallon is somebody who, in an earlier moment would have been seen as one of the more green members of the SDLP. Yet he felt that the idea, and I agreed with him in my heart, although I had to do what I could to keep the show going forward, that there was something wrong with trying to negotiate with people who still retain the option of guns. And remember, the IRA didn't get rid of their guns until 11 years later. It wasn't healthy, and it's not healthy today.
I'm going to throw this open to the floor in a minute, but just before I do, I want to go back to that first question when I asked you about replacing the portrait in your office. Whose portrait did you take down?
Well, I didn't look too closely. I think it could have been Mr. De Valera. I don't know. But I put up I put up 2 pictures as well of Redmond, of General Mulcahy, who was leader of Fine Gael, who didn't become Taoiseach and allowed John A. Costello to become Taoiseach in his place so that an alternative government could be formed, and Sean Lemass, who introduced all these protectionist measures in 1932 and then got a great reputation for getting rid of them in the late 1960s. But he was a good guy. But I have a lot of, I wouldn't want anyone to think that I'm wanting to be in any way dismissive of Mr. De Valera's contribution. I think, in a way, he may not have done quite the right thing, shall we say, in 1922-23, because he wanted to keep control himself, and he may have been unwise in that. But in the 30s and 40s, I think his ability in getting back the ports, for example, was very important. His ability in getting the Constitution adopted, although Fine Gael opposed it at the time for reasons I can't understand, I must say. These were good. So but I wanted to put up John Redmond anyway. It didn't really matter who was coming down; he was going up.
And is it a nice office, by the way?
It's a lovely office. Yeah,
Has the Taoiseach got the best office?
It's got too many doors in it. You never know who's going to come in from any one of the doors. There's a door which only the Taoiseach can go in, but you never know, somebody might come in that way.
What's on the other side of that door?
There's a sort of a lounge room where you can lie back and sleep or something. And then I think it's 3 other doors. So you never know who's going to come in at you. But I'm sure Leo has found a coping mechanism to deal with that.
John Bruton, thank you very much.
So, thank you.
Right, should we have a few questions?
Of course.
Let's, if you wouldn't mind standing up when you ask a question and just introducing yourself. And I think the first hand I see is this gentleman here.
My name is Derek O'Regan.
Oh, I think there's a microphone for you, Derek.
Thanks. Is it on? Thanks. From your time in office as Taoiseach or as a minister, and in your dealings with politicians of the loyalist, unionist side in the north, did you meet any of them that believe in constitutional nationalism, or that believe that it can exist here? Or do they think that even if it appeared to exist here, that they probably wouldn't believe that it was really what it was called to be? In other words, is there any...
You mean believed in it for themselves?
No, that believed that such a thing could exist here, and that therefore could be a basis for a, so we say, dialogue with them.
Oh, absolutely, yes, is the answer to that question. Not very long ago, I was invited by a group of MPs to give a talk in the House of Commons in London on John Redmond and Home Rule. And the person who was one of the leaders in the invitation and who spoke was Geoffrey Donaldson, who is a great admirer of John Redmond and of Irish constitutional nationalism. He's a unionist, but he admired the way in which John Redmond pursued his goals without the threat of violence. I also, I have never asked them, others of them, what do you think of constitutional nationalism, or do you think that all of us in the Republic are people who want to use force against you? It goes without saying that we don't want to use force against them. We've demonstrated that time and time again that we don't, and I think they accept that. But they're fighting their corner, we're fighting our corner, and hopefully our positions will converge rather than diverge.
Gentleman over there, the beard.
John, thank you very much. I think you said that essentially the Belfast Agreement allowed for a reconciliation of the irreconcilables to some extent. Do we not now need a similar reconciliation of the irreconcilables in terms of between Ireland and Britain? And is there not good reason for Ireland to drop its precondition and enter into discussions with its closest neighbour under the agents of whoever in order to try and find some reconciliation on those issues? I think that to some degree there has been a lot of kicking the Brits in terms of what some of our public figures have been saying over the last number of months about Brexit. I think it's an unfortunate development, but it's a development that has happened and a development that we must deal with. And I'd just like you to comment on that.
Well, I think, first of all, there's no precondition being set by the European Union. The backstop was agreed by a British government with the European Union, by a British Prime Minister, Theresa May, in whom the House of Commons had repeatedly voted confidence. Now, subsequently, the House of Commons decided that it wasn't going to accept the agreement that the Prime Minister, in whom they had voted confidence, had accepted. So in that sense, they changed their mind, and eventually she had to leave office. But the backstop is not a precondition imposed by Ireland. It's an agreement entered into between Britain and the European Union. Now, I do see, I have to say, sometimes in some media commentary, commentary about Britain which is less than respectful. And I don't agree with that. But I do not think that the Irish government can be accused of that. And you shouldn't sort of mix things up in this area. As I understand it, for example, offence was taken at an answer given by the Taoiseach when he was asked if a no-deal Brexit could lead to a united Ireland, and he said that it might. And this, because he even uttered the word, was seen as provocative. Well, it wasn't provocative, actually. It was simply a reflection by him on opinion in Northern Ireland, because an opinion poll was done in November of last year in Northern Ireland, where the people in Northern Ireland were asked, would you like a united Ireland if Britain stays in the European Union? And a sizable majority said, no, we'd be happy to stay in the UK. Then they were asked the question, well, would you like a united Ireland if there was the exit of Britain from the European Union on the same terms as the negotiation by Theresa May? And in that circumstance, it was about even Steven, about half and half. But then there was a question put, and this is last November, to the same people if there was a no-deal Brexit, would you favour a united Ireland? And a significant majority of the same people who said they'd stay in the UK if Britain stayed in the EU said they'd opt for a united Ireland if Britain crashed out with no deal. Now, what the Taoiseach, I think, would have been doing on that occasion would have simply been referring to that scientific poll data. It wasn't in any way provocative to refer to it, but unfortunately, people can be very sensitive, unduly sensitive, to a point that, even unpalatable facts, even though there be facts, can be seen as provocative just because of the nature of the facts. And the facts of that opinion poll were, quite revealing, I think, of the fact that there is a big middle ground in Northern Ireland. There's a big group of people who are, in certain circumstances, quite happy to stay as they are, but in other circumstances would move in a direction of coming towards us. The other big question, of course, is, are we on this side of the border ready for anything like that? And I think the answer to that at the moment is certainly no. But I don't think the Taoiseach did anything or said anything that was wrong. Now, Simon Coveney said that he thought there might be United Ireland in his lifetime. That was considered to be provocative. He's a very fit young man. He may live a very long time.
But you've been on the go since 1922.
Yes, exactly. I don't know, and I don't know why he said that, but I don't think it was in any way intended to aggravate people. But people can be aggravated even when there's no intention to aggravate them.
There's a question down here at the front.
Thank you. Emmett Moriarty, originally a native of Rosslea in County Fermanagh, right on the border. I remember during the Good Friday Agreement that America was quite an important player in all of that as well. And I'm just aware that in the last few weeks, some American senators have come out very strongly on the side of the UK in the Brexit negotiations. On the other side, some Irish American congressmen have stated the importance of the Good Friday Agreement, almost coming out the other side of the argument. I'm wondering, from your experience in the US, how you see, if you see America emerging as a player in this, so to speak, in terms of the backstop, and how?
I don't, in terms of being of any help, because as far as I can see, Donald Trump would like to break up the European Union. He regards the European Union as a sort of an adversary, and as a big country, the United States, they would prefer to be able to deal individually with individual European countries rather than have to deal with the European Union as a whole. And he's the first president of the United States ever to have that sort of attitude. But unfortunately, I think that's the attitude he has. And the Republican Party, Tom Cotton and others, who are saying, well, we're ready to negotiate a trade deal with Britain so long as they leave the European Union, and as soon as they do. And the Secretary of State said that they'd be waiting at the foot of the plane with their pen in hand, ready to sign the agreement. I think that's just designed to feed into the pro-Brexit rhetoric with a view to encouraging British public opinion towards a no-deal Brexit, in the hope on the part of the people who are promoting that view in the United States that Brexit could contribute to breaking up the European Union. Well, it's not going to happen. The European Union is not going to break up, and it's certainly not going to break up at the initiative of President Trump or Steve Bannon or any of the other people with Irish names that are populating his administration.
What advice would you give the British government as it looks for that trade deal with the United States?
I'd advise them to give priority to getting a trade agreement with the European Union first, because they do, I don't know what the multiple is, but probably 4 or 5 times or even more times business with their physical neighbours in Europe than they do with the United States. And if they had a good trade deal with the European Union, they'd be in a better position to negotiate with the United States because they would be part of a European understanding. Whereas I think if they're going to negotiate with the United States on their own, without any agreements with anyone else, and I think they will tend to be vulnerable. And while I think President Trump may have a anti-EU, pro-Brexit agenda, once Brexit is achieved, he'll forget about that, and he'll go back to his mercantilist approach to trade negotiation with
America
anybody,
first.
which won't be particularly favourable to Britain or to China or to Mexico or to any of the countries that have Canada that have done trade deals with the United States. The United States doesn't stick with its trade deals. They they withdrew from the TPP. They renegotiated NAFTA. They want things on their own terms, and well, I'd wish the British government luck.
Who's got another question? There's one over here.
Andrew Coleman from Bandon. It's nice to meet you again, John. I think last time when you were Taoiseach, you came in, you unveiled a monument and a booklet to the war dead from Bandon. And that was, I think, the first time a Taoiseach had done that in the Republic since the foundation of the state. So I deeply appreciate again to be in your company. Two questions. One, you identified the two elements of identity and respect as being the crucial elements for conflict in Northern Ireland and in Ireland as a whole. How do you? What would your views be as to dealing in a no-deal situation in the north? How are we maintain that respect of identity and of belonging in a no-deal Northern Ireland? And also, we're coming to the 100th anniversary of both the formation of Stormont, that Parliament, and the Parliament itself. How would you suggest we should commemorate, respect, and explore in the context of a new Ireland and a free Ireland?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I was really delighted when I was invited to open the memorial to people who died in British uniforms in the First World War in Bandon. And particularly because it was in Bandon, in the heart of County Cork, where there had been such conflict subsequently. And I commend you specifically for the courage that you had in organising that. I wouldn't have been at it if you hadn't put the thing in place. So I give all the credit to you for that. I think the question you asked, though, is one that we need to think about very seriously. What can we do in the event of a no-deal Brexit to mitigate the damage that inevitably flows from it? First of all, I think we need to recognise that we have failed to make adequate use of the British-Irish Intergovernmental Council. We have a parliamentary body that has, representatives from the Parliament of Guernsey and the Parliament of the Isle of Man and the Parliament of, all these other dependencies, plus the two parliaments on this island. It doesn't do very much. And of course it can't do very much as long as the institutions in Northern Ireland are not functioning. That's another story. So I think we need to look at setting up a high level, or even trying to initiate some sort of a negotiation with Britain in the context of no deal on things we can still do together that are not affected by or can be done in some form or other together between Britain and Ireland, regardless of whether Britain is out of the EU or not. I think we need to give a lot of thought to that. Now, I remember something I did when Tony Blair came in, and I only overlapped with Tony Blair for about 2 months. We had our own election, and we didn't win. But when he came into office, I studied the Labour Party manifesto, And there were all sorts of things that he was proposing to do for Britain. And I wrote to him suggesting, I can't remember what they were now, indeed, but there were things like to do with improving the life of people in Britain. I said, why can't we do some of these on the basis of both islands? That we would have a joint British-Irish institution to do some of these environmental or social improvement schemes that were being proposed in the Labour Party manifesto. Now, obviously I lost office, so I didn't follow it up subsequently. But I think we need to be thinking like that now. We need to be looking at the thing, we need to be looking in detail at what could we still do jointly with the British that would create or maintain some of the atmosphere of cooperation and frequent meetings and social contact between British and Irish ministers, British and Irish civil servants. That's routine now in the European Union, but which will all stop once they leave. Because Irish officials won't be running into British officials anymore. So we've got to create reasons for them to meet. And I think that is something that a lot of thought could be given to by the Irish government. I wouldn't be, produce it now, because we're hoping that there will still not be a no-deal situation. But we could be working on that. The Irish government could be working on what they might be able to suggest in that context.
Do you think there's anything that the Irish government can do to avoid no deal, or is it, as Simon Coveney often says, a problem in London for London to fix?
Well, I think negotiation can only occur if you have somebody who's willing to negotiate on the other side of the table. On the basis of public statements, there's nothing has been said in Britain that gives the slightest indication that there's a willingness to go to negotiate on any of the things that are of interest to us. When they're saying, for instance, that the backstop must be removed in its entirety as a condition for negotiation. But, maybe different signals are being given in private. I don't know. Maybe the Irish ambassador in London is hearing different things. Maybe the British ambassador here is coming forward with suggestions. I don't think there was much discussed in the phone call between Leo Varadkar and Boris Johnson, but I know Leo. I know Boris Johnson's European Union advisor slightly. I remember meeting him at a conference. He's a very reasonable guy. He used to be the chief executive of the Scotch Whisky Association, so you can understand he's a man who knows the sort of palliative virtues of conviviality. So perhaps he may be able to be somebody that John Callan could talk to. I don't know, but I mean, until you're actually looking at people and you see how they react to suggestions, do they look down or do they look, are they interested? Is there sympathy towards what you're saying, or is there just someone going through the motions? Until you're actually physically with them, there's no way you can say. But there would be no point in the absence of an atmosphere in the Irish government suggesting anything. It would suggest weakness.
It's nearly time for us all to enjoy the palliative qualities of conviviality over in the bar. Are there any final questions before? Okay, there's one more over here.
Mark Minahan from Neuros. Did you ever postulate, Mr. Bruton, on the possibility or where Ireland would be today if in the first 50 years of our free state or republic, where we had a huge influence of the Roman Catholic Church, if we'd had 20 or 25% unionists in that group on the initial formation of the state, and where would we be today if we had that much time under our belts?
Well, I think that's something that was recognised by the first government, W.T. Cosgrave's government, because he went out of his way to ensure that there would be unionists in the Senate. And indeed, some of the legislation, such as the divorce legislation, I think, banning divorce, was opposed in the Senate because of that unionist presence, which Mr. Cosgrave had put in there. I think if we had if Home Rule had gone forward, if there'd been no First World War, and there was a possibility of the 6 counties joining the other 26 in a closer union under Home Rule, and that was certainly going to be a possibility, but not a certainty if Home Rule was enacted. I think that would have had an influence here. It would have diminished some of the overreach by the Catholic Church. Now, I think there are explanations for the overreach by the Catholic Church. I saw an article that was quoted by somebody who's here about the anti-Catholicism that was in British political life in the lead-in to our independence, and that to some extent the overweening influence of the Catholic Church here was a sort of a reaction against that. But I think if, as you suggest, we had more unionist involvement in the institutions of the state, whether they were in the state or not, I think we would have had, perhaps a more balanced approach, and that would have been better for the Catholic Church in the long run. Better for the Catholic Church today, if something like that had happened, than what has happened. But I'll be addressing that on another occasion somewhere else.
That would be an ecumenical matter, I hear from the audience.
Yes.
That's a good place to stop and let the conviviality begin.
Yeah.
But John Bruton, thank you very much for giving us so much of your time.